Today marks Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we were struck by a new survey indicating that memories of the Holocaust are fading here in the United States.
Ray Kaner was a young girl when she was taken to Auschwitz, one of Hitler's concentration camps.
You couldn't imagine the enormity of the suffering what we had.
She recounted her struggle to the students, who were mesmerized and astonished.
I think about how something so immoral could happen to people, how humanity could go so low.
Just hearing such horrific stories, it just makes me angry that how often people can still say it didn't happen.
It's very sad that with all the information available to us, that people are not aware of what has happened.
And more than 40% of adults and 2/3 of millennials don't know what Auschwitz was.
41% of adults don't know. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't. I think so many people are just concerned with what's in front of them. I don't think history holds the place that it used to. I think one of the big problems with our country is that people just aren't that interested in history, and they're not interested in other cultures.
The number of Holocaust survivors worldwide is estimated at 400,000, and before long, we won't be able to ask them face to face what happened.
Ironically, what always ends up happening when people declare a utopia, I mean, whether you're talking about Plato's Republic, or which was all about that very idea, or Karl Marx Das Kapital with communism, it's always the same thing. If we do this and we do that, we can create this perfect society and everybody will live happily ever after. And it never happens. Instead of utopia, we end up with what's called dystopia. And dystopia literally means, it's literally translated, not a good place. Not a good place. In other words, humanity always tries to create these utopian environments, and it becomes degraded and degrading. Over time, it feels unpleasant and undesirable, it's dysfunctional and dying, and frequently it's a place that's just simply frightening. Now, I don't speak this theoretically, I speak this experientially. Because when I was a hippie, I lived communally. I lived in a commune in the mountains of Oregon, and we shared everything equally. But over time, just like the Animal Farm, over time some people became more equal than other people. And then you begin to see this disparity, that people who had control of certain things began to take advantage of that, and their needs somehow mysteriously became greater than your need. And that's the nature of human history, because as Adam Smith said in his book on the Russians, when he was talking about the Soviet Union, he made this observation once. He said, almost got him thrown out of Russia. He says, it seems to me like the Politburo leaders are living more like the czars than the czars did. And that's simply the case, so that even today they have a democratic nation which has a Putin who is referred to as Tsar Putin, because he's the most powerful man that's reigned over that country since the czars. Maybe more than Stalin at this point. It's kind of frightening. But it's a thing that the Bible describes as really the consequence of a fallen world. Or Peterson put it, we're the ones who have made a mess of things. Now, that's an important acknowledgement that is hard for you and I to make, because most of the time we like to say, well, the reason this happened is because of. Have you ever noticed how quick you are to go to an excuse for whatever it is you've done? Please don't look at me like you don't know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's just incredible, because somebody comes to you with a criticism, and how often do you sit back and say, let me weigh that. I think maybe that's something I should really think about. Is not almost intuitive response to go, well, maybe you're right, but I did that because and on we go. Is this just a men thing, or is this just... But coming to grips with the fact, number one, that sin is the root cause of what's dysfunctional in the world. It's not too much carbon in the atmosphere. You know, it's not because there's injustice amongst men. It goes so much deeper than that. It's the root of human nature that repeatedly expresses itself. So when somebody says that history repeats itself, it doesn't repeat itself. What you find is human nature always responds the same way in whatever circumstances we happen to find ourselves in. We can talk about Nazism, when many people don't hear this today, but the primary objective of Hitler's efforts was to destroy Christianity because he thought it weakened the will of men by telling them to be humble and to love their neighbors and to forgive sin. He thought that just leads to weakness. We've got to get rid of Christianity. And communism, of course, speaks of itself. And as we look at just the combination of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, we know now, looking back historically, that at least 60 million people died because of their reign and their rule. And they were deadly set against the idea that anything that had to do with religion, in particular, they hated Christianity. That when that Christianity is removed, it opens the doors for the floodgates of evil. And here's the internal struggle we all go through. You know, I think that as a couple of psychotherapists by the name of Rosenblatt and Horowitz wrote a book called Wrestling Angels, and they had this great statement that they said, every generation builds its own towers, talking about Babel. I would say every man and every woman has spent some amount of time in their life trying to build their own tower that they can erect as a monument to their own selfhood. And it can come in a variety of forms and expressions. But at the end of the day, every generation also will find that it'll get a Nimrod to help them do it as their guiding star on the horizon. You see, Nimrod is the central figure of the Babel story, and he becomes the first clearly identifiable Antichrist figure in human history. And we all know that over the centuries, and there have been many imitators, Christ pretenders, if you will, whether it be Genghis Khan or Napoleon or Hitler or Stalin, Mussolini, they did the same thing. They promised that they would lead people into a golden age, an earthly utopia, but instead what they brought is Babel. In their aftermath always came chaos and confusion, as well as death and destruction.
Unspeakable horror seen through the eyes of children.
Very striking that this could have happened.
On this Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, commemorating the inhumane slaughter of 6 million Jews in Hitler's death camps, an extraordinary exhibit and gathering at the Museum of Jewish Heritage.
Black Earth is a history of the Holocaust, and it's a traditional history in the sense that it does recount the events from 1933 to 1945, but its particular emphasis or its particular valence is its emphasis on explanation. So where I began the book was from the observation, which others might contest, that Holocaust studies had moved into a memorial mode without ever having achieved satisfactory explanation, and that the memorial mode was taking up the space that would have been needed for explanatory work, and that in particular the memorial mode allowed us, perhaps ironically, to fall back into national modes of discussing the Holocaust, because when one discusses memory, one invariably discusses a national memory, and almost always one's national memory. There is data to back up these assertions. So the last time I looked, which was a couple of years ago, well over 90% of the conferences devoted to the Holocaust were not devoted to the Holocaust, but they were devoted to the memory of the Holocaust, which is a quite different subject. And for me, it always poses, memory in general poses what I think of as the genitive question, which is probably a slightly perverse way of putting it, having to do with having studied too many languages, which is memory of what? And do we have the of what?
When we see that imperfection ourselves, we love to blame it on our parents, on our spouse, on our bosses, our government, the church, bureaucrats, bullies, assault rifles. We find something to point to and say, that's the cause. If we can just eliminate that, then all of those bad things will go away. And yet the list of things that are necessary to eliminate is unending, and we never even get close to getting to the end of it. It was a Russian philosopher, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who discovered after spending 8 years in Stalin's Siberian gulag or prison, they were work camps, more accurately called death camps. And he found in the midst of that moment that the problem lay somewhere other than in governments and in politics and other things. Here's what he wrote in his great work, The Gulag Archipelago. He says, "It was granted to me to carry away from my prison years on my bent back which nearly broke beneath its load, this essential experience, how a human being becomes evil and how he becomes good. In the intoxication of youthful successes, I had felt myself to be infallible, and I was therefore cruel. In the surfeit of power, I was a murderer and an oppressor." And he means that quite literally. "In my most evil moments, I was convinced that I was doing good. And I was well supplied with systematic arguments. It was only when I lay there on rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good. And gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, not between classes of people, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts." What Solzhenitsyn discovered is something that Paul said 2,000 years before. In fact, Paul described in Ephesians 4, he says, they walk in the futility of their mind, or as the NLT puts it, they walk in the hopelessness of their confusion. They're hopelessly confused, having their understanding darkened. Philip said they live in a world of shadows, being alienated or estranged from the life of God because of the deliberate ignorance, not a ignorance that comes from lack of opportunity, but it's something like, as he says later on in 2 Peter 3, they've determined not to know the truth. It's not that they just don't know the truth, they made this determined effort that they're not going to know it. They're deliberately estranged from God, because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feelings have abandoned themselves to uncontrolled sensuality, to a life of profligacy with the insatiable appetite for more and more and more. Now, our nation was founded e pluribus unum, out of many comes one, and you know, that was the idea that people would come from around the world and they would gather together and there'd be a unity about this new identity of being Americans and living in the United States and settling this nation. Today we're kind of moving in the other direction. We're going out of one, we're going to have many, and we find as we talk about greater and greater diversity, what happens is that the idea of unity begins to fall apart. And so we are probably, as a nation, the most divided we have ever been. And unless something very dramatic changes, like a great revival, it'll probably continue and become worse and worse and worse, so that what we'll find ourselves dividing ourselves around tribal groups rather than around a central ideal. Because it's no longer about the idea of a certain ideal of being part of a republic of certain ideals, but rather in the rights of man based upon the Bill of Rights. But it's a people who are gathered around for what the government can do and what they can derive for themselves on a personal level. It becomes very self-serving. And that's part of the thing I think it's interesting, because when God is looking upon the Tower of Babel, they are pursuing this amazing unity. They got one message, they've got one leader, they've got one passion and goal and objective, and God says what's going to come out of this is something very dark and evil. And if I don't break this up right now, their organization and their unity is going to lead to a bad thing, not a good thing. Because it's kind of like the idea of the mafia or any other kind of criminal enterprise. These guys are very, very unified, mainly because you die if you aren't. But the idea is they have this tremendous unity, but it's a unity and agreement for illegal gain and criminal enterprise. And so unity is not just an end unto itself. So then people say we just need to come together and be unified. The central question that people don't often ask is, what are we unifying around? What is it that's going to bring us a oneness? I think that as a couple of psychotherapists by the name of Rosenblatt and Horowitz wrote a book called Wrestling Angels, and they had this great statement that they said, every generation builds its own towers, talking about Babel. I would say every man and every woman has spent some amount of time in their life trying to build their own tower that they can erect as a monument to their own selfhood. And it can come in a variety of forms and expressions. But at the end of the day, every generation also will find that it'll get a Nimrod to help them do it as their guiding star on the horizon. I've often tried to explain to people that what made the American experiment so successful is our founding fathers were guided by one significant principle. We don't trust each other. We don't trust each other. If you look at it, if you study law, as I've done, you find out it's set up as counterbalances because it basically says everybody's sinful, and if we don't have some kind of accountability, we can't be trusted. So the moment one part gets more power than it should have, it just becomes corrupted. That's the way it's been historically. But the centerpiece of this name-making, fame generation, self-promoting, ego-boasting enterprise that they were fomenting here in Babel was to build a tower, they said, that reaches unto heaven. Now, today, most scholars believe that this tower was a forerunner of what we know as the ziggurats. There's about 20 of them that still exist, and basically a few have been rebuilt, but most of them are pretty cluttered. But the oldest that was ever found is depicted in the slide that you see from the ruins of ancient Ur, the place where Abraham came from before he went to Canaan. And they look very similar to pyramids of Egypt, but they served a completely different purpose. You see, the pyramids were tombs. Kings were buried in tombs, and the reason they got bigger and bigger is because people kept on finding ways to pick the lock, and so they try and find harder and harder ways for people to basically get in and steal their afterlife from them. But what we find is these ziggurats were built initially as man-made temples. They referred to them as holy mountains, or we might say by the song, it was a stairway to heaven, this idea that there they could get to heaven, there they would encounter God. Rather than beseeching God to come down and to save, what they were doing is endeavoring to save themselves by raising themselves up to where God was. Not that God would descend to man, but they would ascend up to where God was. And this is the essence of all false religion. Man reaching heaven through his own hard work and efforts. You see, all religions other than Christianity have this same work-based dynamic as the foundation of their whole belief system. Basically, you attain Godhead or something like it by ritual, by sacrifice, by service, by purification, by disciplines and intellectual achievements, or more recently, as it's become the gospel of Oprah, it's by finding the personal God within.
The art of the selfie, the quest for the perfect picture to post on social media.
Well, now there is a shrine of sorts honoring the current craze. CBS 2's Joe Kwan went to Glendale to check out the Selfie Museum.
This is all part of the show. Creators of this Museum of Selfies say that this is the first in the world, as far as they know. Soliciting all selfie socializers, it's time to indulge your senses.
They made a name for themselves, but their name became a mockery and a taunt. And so is it for everyone who allows their own selfish ambitions to be the guiding principle of their life. And increasingly, it's sad, we are told in our culture that selfish ambition should be the guiding principle. Just get in touch with what you want and then go for it. Well, for me, that would be schizophrenic because I change my mind as what I want every time I think about it. You see, One of the things that James warned about, and we see fulfilled in this story, is he said in James 3:16, where selfish ambition exists, there will be disorder and every vile practice.